I'm a former educator, an anti-fracking activist, and activist in support of BDS and in support of Palestinians' rights, and someone who's been a strong advocate on a local board of education for a local choice and voice in education. And when I say choice, I don't mean the kind of choice Betsy DeVos is talking about. I mean the kind of choice that involves communities controlling rather than corporations or corporate motivated state takeovers like we experienced recently in Youngstown, Ohio. And my personal focus on education and on empowering communities comes very much from my background in the ghetto in Jersey. I was raised by an African American mother who lived through the Newark race riots. Remember what that was like? I was raised by an immigrant Iranian father, and we were very poor. We were working poor, which is really something that should not exist in a fair or truly free country. But that was the circumstances under which I was raised. And it informed my perspective on economic inequality, on racial inequality, and on all the many ways in which people are cut out of the decision making that deeply affects their lives and their futures. And these are the issues that we have to deal with as Americans, and particularly as Greens, considering our party's values. And so when people ask me what the Green Party is about, this is a mantra that I repeat because I feel it encapsulates the best of our values. We are the party of justice. Justice for the earth and all its people. And that's my goal as a campaign, to seek that justice. And it's a very green goal rooted in our party's values. So what do we mean when we say that? When we talk about environmental justice, included in that is what we call the Green New Deal. Now, when you talk about the Green New Deal, you often have to ask who's Green New Deal, because it's been co-opted, there's so many different versions of it. There are multiple versions amongst Greens. So what do we mean when we say the Green New Deal? There's some elemental aspects: 100% renewable energy by 2030. We're not talking about just for electricity in your home. We're talking about 100% renewable energy. We're going to put an end to the extraction of fossil fuels. A massive amount of that is accounted for by transportation, and some of these different flavors of quote-unquote Green New Deals don't really cover the full range. So we have to be clear about that. We're talking about a mobilization to ensure that this takes place in enough time to deal with the dire climate change crisis that we're in. We have a limited amount of time, scientists tell us. And so we have to mobilize the country. And that's where the term New Deal comes into play, because it is a kind of mobilization like the Roosevelt-era New Deal. But we have to also deal with issues such as community building and greater accessibility as a part of this Green New Deal. And included in that is mass transit solutions, for instance. You know, I represented a city where we had so many citizens who were on the lower economic margins of society, but so few options for them to be able to access a clinic, a supermarket where there's fresh produce. They couldn't even get on a local bus and get to that easily enough. And they certainly didn't have it in their neighborhoods. So when we have those issues, we can't just talk about we're going to give you health care, we're going to give you a universal basic income. Where will you go to seek access to health care if you don't have a clinic in your neighborhood? We have to deal with those elemental issues and the community building behind it. And so our campaign adds on to what we call the Green New Deal, something called the Green Path Forward, a recognition that those principles require greater applicability from the bottom up and the top down in a global sense. We cannot solve climate change, global climate change, with what we do between California and New York. We have to engage in purposeful geopolitical realignment and diplomatic efforts to not just bring about peace, shoulder to shoulder with other countries, but to secure planetary survival. Instead of the toxic conversations we've been having lately, especially under this administration with other countries, we need to be having fruitful conversations about how we work together to save this planet together. We also have to address the other crises that are happening in an environmental sense across this planet. We have to deal with the out-of-control plastic pollution, for instance. And our campaign is very assertive about banning single-use plastics. We are finding plastics in the deepest part, the deepest trenches of our oceans. It's seriously affecting wildlife. But I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention, when we talk about the Green New Deal and climate change, the rapacious effects of agribusiness in this country and across the world. People saw footage of the Amazon burning, and many people cried when they saw it, but not enough conversation took place about how that came to be. Ranchers being allowed free rein to clear land. We have to recognize, and scientists have brought forward the information for us to be able to recognize that we cannot truly solve this climate change issue until we deal with the effects that agribusiness has had on our climate, on our environment. And so we need to set targets also by 2030 for dealing with those effects. The overconsumption and the over-raising, the rapacious aspects of agribusiness that have in effect fueled our climate crisis. We have to set benchmarks and targets for 2030 for that as well. So our campaign is taking a far more comprehensive approach about all these issues, recognizing that yes, time is short, and because it is, we cannot afford to let down any aspect or any part of the global climate change crisis. So I mentioned for the earth and all its people, justice for the earth and all its people. That means that we have to put forward a robust social, racial, and economic justice platform. Many people look out at the Green Party outside looking in and say, well, it's an environmentalist party. Some use derogatory terms, which I don't take as derogatory, but some might, like tree hugger. That's all you're focused on. I love trees. We have to have trees. But the environment and how that is a part of our environmental agenda isn't all that we're about. We have a very comprehensive platform as a party. But, and this is just introspection as a Green, our party, some of our candidates, we're not always as assertive as we can be about the full range of issues that our party needs to address and put out on Front Street so that people feel their problems are actually being solved, being represented in this process. So yes, free pre-K, free college, universal single-payer health care, all of those things. But if you don't mention the issue of local control, then you haven't dealt with the issues that people are dealing with real time on an everyday basis across this country. We've got an educational system that's under attack. Public education is under attack. They're pulling the rug out from underneath communities. You must address that. You must also address environmental and educational racism. The community I serve, although it is not 70% African American, the public school system is. And add to that another 14% Hispanic to make a district that's overwhelmingly students of color in a city that is more evenly split. Why? Because those who could took their kids and put them in private schools, Catholic schools. Those that could not got stuck languishing in educational failure in a public school system that is now under a state takeover for profit. That is educational racism. When you have communities targeted for pollution, for fracking activities, because you think they won't care about this community due to its demographic makeup, that's environmental racism. And we need to be at the forefront of calling these crises what they are. We need a living wage across this country, of course. But we need to recognize that setting a figure like $15 is not enough. $15 is not enough to make it in San Francisco. It's not enough to make it in Los Angeles. Let's be real. And the struggles people are going through in places like that where I've been to California 9 times, and every time I've been in every city I've been in, the tent cities seem to grow. We need to have a living wage that's responsive to the actual experience of people in the different parts of this country, as well as responsive to cost of living, inflation, all of the realities that go into trying to make a living in this country and paying your bills due to this capitalist system's effect on people's ability to live in adequate means. So we're working to end homelessness. We want to devote resources to homes, not to the military-industrial complex as we have been. We want to end police brutality by ensuring community control of policing. Note the word I used there, not oversight, where you have a committee that says, we think we should do this, we think we should do that, and may or may not actually have real control. We want the community to control policing so the police officers are afraid of taking steps to disenfranchise people of their rights because they could lose their jobs. We want to end private prisons and the corporate contracting that's making incarceration a brisk and profitable business. We want to end the war on drugs that's feeding into the mass incarceration in this country. And we must end redlining. Not enough discussion or attention has been given to this issue. People seem to act some as if this issue has been dealt with, especially post the Community Reinvestment Act of the Carter era. But the reality is, if that solved the problems, we wouldn't have over 60 metro areas across this country that still have the same segregationist-like effects in terms of access to housing, in terms of the red lines between neighborhoods racially. It is still a problem, and we must ensure that the financial industry, that banking and lending is equal, and they're making sure to give opportunities to people of color on an equal basis for housing. Now, our campaign has an ambitious platform, including what we call the People of Color Bill of Rights, and that includes dealing with each of these issues in a very pointed way, because we recognize that as much rights as we say we have as a country, the experience has not, unfortunately, been equal. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention our platform's attention to issues of war and peace. We are going to ensure that resources are spent here building a better educated citizenry and a stronger infrastructure instead of destroying other countries and raining death upon civilians across the world, as has happened under Democratic and Republican administrations. We're going to close those foreign bases, we're going to slash the war budget, we're going to fund a Department of Peace instead of quote-unquote defense, which should read as war. We're going to stop funding and aiding human rights abuses wherever in the world, whichever country, and a particular attention to Israel. The issue of Israel-Palestine, a long festering one, which this administration has aided and abetted abuses against the Palestinian people. And some of you here know I feel very strongly about that, strongly enough that I lost my position as a rabbi in my community for opposing Israel's abuses. But silence equals death. And our party has been very vocal on this. Our candidate should be vocal. We need to end America's interventionism and colonialism abroad, as well as on the quote-unquote home front in terms of how we deal with our quote-unquote territories. Puerto Rico should be independent. The era of holding colonies should be long past for this country. There are some that look at the issue of defense, air quotes, still in terms of minimal deterrence and playing this game of I'll put my bombs, my nukes here, I'll fence off against you and ward you off. Whether you're playing with nuclear or without nuclear, that idea of the quote-unquote minimal deterrent and ratcheting it up, that's not the kind of approach or strategy. It's very primitive. It's not the way to build a stronger, safer connection with the rest of the world that will ensure the survival of this planet. We need to focus instead on building peace as opposed to a quote-unquote minimal deterrent policy. I have to mention something very personal to me. I did, at the start of this, mention that I am a son of an Iranian immigrant. And so we are now at the brink of war, it seems, with Iran. There has been a military back and forth. And I do have family in Iran. But even if I didn't, the people who are there would still be human beings. And wherever human beings are in the world, wherever there is creation in the world, we have a responsibility to ensure the lives of human beings, the lives, the health and the welfare of animals, of living beings in this planet. The game that's being played by the Trump administration is a dangerous and a murderous one. Their assassinations, their targeted assassinations, are primitive, are unconscionable. It's not the first foray that America has had in intervening in Iran's affairs, and of course this country's intervened in countries' affairs all across the world. Chile comes to mind. What happened in Chile was just unconscionable, and what they've been doing in Venezuela and Bolivia. Okay? This is what this country has been doing with its interventionist policies. That has to come to an end. Okay?
Hey, Dario, could you wrap it up in the next couple minutes so we can have time for questions?
We've seen the nuclear deal be repudiated by Iran now. We have seen a military back and forth. We've seen the world become and feel less safe as a result of what is taking place. And our administration will seek an end to U.S. aggression and imperialism, peaceful relationships with all nations, and recognize the fact that if we're going to secure the health and the welfare of this planet, we have got to deal with other countries as equals. Iran is in the top 20 of carbon emitters. We should be having fruitful conversations with them about how we work to end this man-made climate change. So, just to wrap up, what do we need going into 2020? A lot has been said about how the Green Party may get flack for being spoilers, air quotes. How are we going to deal with that? How are we going to deal with all that in the age of Trump? We're going to have a candidate that has to be dynamic, that's going to be energetic, that's going to be able to cut through all of that, and is going to be able to be the voice for the voiceless and bring the voices of the oppressed to the forefront, to represent our truly comprehensive agenda as a party. And that's what I'm aiming to be. That's what our campaign is aiming to do, to focus on the message behind that brand as a party, which is justice for the earth and all its people. So at this time, I thank you for listening. I open up the floor to any questions you might have about how we're going to achieve those goals together. Yes.
Thank you. Well, as I introduced myself, I told you I'm running for the U.S. Senate, and one of the things that I'm trying to do is fixing the wages and living expenses, right? So this is what everyone wants to do. But raising minimum wages, it has a lot of concerns, especially when you look at Amazon lobbying politicians to do that. You know, they don't do charity. They want something from it, and apparently what they're doing is trying to get everything for themselves. So 15 minimum wage has resulted in a clause in about like 9,000 stores or something. All of them goes to Amazon. So when we raise the minimum wage with the current situations, it wouldn't help like anything. It will hurt small businesses which we want to grow, right? So if you raise it, what would you do to just make sure these small businesses stay there? And how do you grow it? This is one. And the other thing, this thing I would like to do is, instead of raising the minimum wage, to have ratio between the shareholders, the profit that goes to the shareholders and the workers. With that, I think the concentration of power, the income inequality would be solved. But I'm not an economist, so I don't know for sure how it would work. But this is an idea.
You know, it's funny, this underpaying of workers doesn't even really work in the context of capitalism. And I am not a capitalist. I am a socialist. So I believe that workers should own the means for production and for distribution. And that means a fundamental system change. So that's part of the answer to how we're going to address that. There's going to have to be fundamental system change. You can't just layer minimum wage changes over top of a system that is still abusive. But here's the thing. As I mentioned, even in the context of capitalism, this underpaying doesn't work because you have workers who are so severely underpaid they aren't able to buy things that continue to feed into the system that, in a capitalist sense, creates jobs. The number one thing that people say about the raising the minimum wage is that it's going to be a job killer. People are going to lose their jobs. What about the small businesses? The reality is we're quite capable of paying more proportionally to the cost of living because we used to. We used to pay more. It's just that businesses have been allowed to get away with saying this job killer mantra over and over and over again, and have completely swat away the idea that people deserve to have a living wage because capitalism is in hyperdrive right now. Capitalism is in hyperdrive, the abuses are in hyperdrive, and minimum wage is not what's going to kill jobs. There are many things killing jobs, including the fact that companies are getting even cheaper, cutthroat, abusive wages outside of the country. We don't have control over our system. We are allowing corporations to get away